Welcome to FO Podcasts. With me is Gary Grappo, a distinguished US diplomat, a retired distinguished US diplomat, a keen hiker, a multilingual scholar, and a jolly good chap. Welcome, Gary.
Thanks very much, Atul. It's always great to join you.
Gary, the Middle East is nonstop fun. It seems shits and giggles are the order of the day. And now we have the Iranian president dead, in fact, very dead. His helicopter mysteriously drops down from the sky. Now, obviously, as you know, some people are saying it's all Mossad's doing. It happened near the Azerbaijani border. Some people are saying it could be the Azeris, the separatists. Others are saying it could be the internal factions in Iran. Maybe it's the IRGC. And of course, there are others who say it's just a plain simple crash. This being the Middle East, there'll be conspiracy theories and theories and then some more. So what's your view as to what's happened? And then we'll get into what does this mean going forward. Over to you. What's really happened? You're a former Air Force officer, so you're in a good position to comment.
Yes, and I think if we just look at the facts, it's well known that the helicopter, after departing this dam inauguration ceremony on the Azerbaijani-Iranian border, took off in inclement weather conditions, very heavy fog, and needed to fly about 150 kilometers or so to Tabriz, I think it was, through very mountainous terrain. So mountainous terrain, heavy fog in a helicopter. It's not a good alignment of circumstances. Basketball enthusiasts around the world will recall the tragic accident of the basketball great Kobe Bryant several years ago, flying state-of-the-art helicopter with a very experienced pilot, a very short flight in Southern California, but also through fog, and crashed in a mountainside in the Santa Monica Mountains because of the fog.
And just so that our listeners realize, helicopters are naturally unstable. They are not as stable as airplanes, and mountains make judgment really difficult.
Well, exactly. And unlike a fixed wing aircraft, they have very little to no glide capability. So if something malfunctions, and it could be a mechanical failure too, there's really only one possibility, and the pilot looks for a place to land as quickly as possible. But in this case, while mechanical failure is certainly a possibility, I think it was weather, and ultimately you have to question the judgment of the pilot to take off in such terrible flight conditions. Apparently, the rescue helicopters were reporting visibility in 1 and 2 digit meters, which is not the sort of conditions that any pilot would want to fly. So I think that is the logical conclusion to draw from this. Yes, conspiracy theories will abound. After all, as you said, it is the Middle East. That's what they do. The first one is Mossad, of course.
Very little for Mossad's global image. It's in marketing for them.
Of course, and I'm sure there are a lot of chuckles in their headquarters over this. But when you ask the question why, there's no clear answer, because most people know that the real decision maker in Iran was not Raisi. It's a supreme leader, Khamenei.
He wasn't important enough to be killed. Poor chap might have been president, but he wasn't important enough.
Yeah. Now, as we perhaps may discuss shortly, he was probably at the top of the list, or close to the top of the list, in terms of likely candidates to succeed the supreme leader. But nevertheless, in his current capacity, there wasn't much in it for the Israelis to go to this kind of trouble and risk. I mean, don't forget, a little over a month ago, they were slinging missiles at one another over the Israeli killing of a senior IRGC commander in Syria. So the Israelis would think very, very long and hard about going after the president of the country. And as I said before, why? And I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to that, because there is none. There really isn't. Americans, hardly. Why? He'll just be followed by someone else of similar political ilk. And then you can go down the list. I think is equally likely to those possibilities as someone internal. I mean, Raisi had a lot of enemies. If you look at the history of this man in Iranian politics, he was known as the hanging judge for the role he played in the purge trials of the mid and late 1980s after the revolution and in the course of and after the Iran-Iraq war. And it is estimated that he presided over the death sentences of some 3,000 to 5,000 dissidents. 3,000 to 5,000. And so, yeah, he was known throughout Iran as the hanging judge. And, he lived up to that reputation throughout his career. He was a hardliner to the core. Let's not forget that shortly after coming to the presidency, we had the Masa Amini case, the young woman who was arrested, tortured, and killed for allegedly improperly wearing a hijab, which ignited, of course, demonstrations, riots throughout the country that led to the deaths of over 500 people. And he doubled down on the hijab policy, insisting that all women wear the hijab and wear it properly. The hijab as well as a long cloak. So he was a dyed-in-the-wool Muslim clerical hardliner, very much in the vein of the Supreme Leader Khamenei, and so not particularly well loved. And if you just look at the results of the last election, in which he won, they had the lowest turnout in their history, something like the mid 40%. It's also worth noting that in the parliamentary elections that were just held shortly before Raisi's death, the election turnout was under 10%. Under 10%. That's really shocking. That makes America's election turnout look absolutely stellar. So you have to go some way to get that. So
let us take a step back. You're saying he wasn't he wasn't any Qasem Soleimani. So the motive for either the Israelis or Americans to kill him, and Qasem Soleimani was their superstar general, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, a superstar general who was killed in Baghdad, if I remember correctly, in Iraq. And that led to a great outpouring of grief in Iran. Now, this chap wasn't that important for Israel or America. However, he had lots of internal enemies. So if we are looking for motives, there are more motives inside the country for people to get rid of him than outside. Maybe the pilot had some of his family hung, and maybe the pilot deliberately crashed. Iran is a great tradition of martyrdom, shaheed.
Yeah, but I dismiss pretty much most of these as very, very low probability.
Here I am fanning more conspiracy theories.
Yes, they were flying in the fog. They were flying in the fog, and
flying in the fog. That would make a great headline, by the way. Flying in the fog.
Yes, and there's not a competent pilot today who would choose to fly in the fog, fixed wing or rotary wing.
And northern Iran is known to be treacherous and mountainous. I believe it's the Elbrus Mountains, isn't it?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. And so it's tricky territory. So enough about what happened. Now, what next? As you said, he was likely to succeed the supreme leader. Who succeeds him now? Is it his son? What happens now? Do we have another election with less than 10% voter turnout? What happens to relations with other Arab neighbors and Israel? Or is it just much ado about nothing? Things will go on pretty much as they always have, and this chap wasn't that important anyway.
I think it's fair to say that in terms of general policy, very little, if anything, will change. We are going to have to see a change in the personality occupying the supreme leader position. And we're just going to have to wait until that happens. The current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is, I think, 85, rumored to be in poor health, but that rumor has been floating around for 6, 7, 8 years. So he seems to be hanging on.
He just refuses to die,
Yes.
much to the disappointment of his enemies
No kidding. Well,
and potential successors.
And to many of the Iranians. He is not especially popular now. In fact, that's a fair characteristic of Iranian attitudes toward their entire government. This is a very unpopular government. This government does not enjoy popular legitimacy, which accounts for the low turnout in these recent elections, which is why what probably weighs most on the mind of the supreme leader right now is having to call these elections, which will take place at the end of next month, and risking another very poor turnout because the list of candidates are going to be previous also rans, just second and third level functionaries in the Iranian bureaucracy or political system. No one that really grabs the attention of the Iranian public. Moreover, there is little expectation that a genuine reformer would be permitted to run in the election, much less win it. In fact, if
Terror has passed, there was a time when reformers did run for president. They rose to the highest office, but it seems the regime has calcified. The regime has clamped down on any whiff of dissent. And it seems now you've got to be an apparatchik to run in the fake elections.
The two previous reformers who ran and won, they both won fairly big, were Khatami in the 90s and Rouhani, who preceded Raisi. And they were effectively drummed out by the hardliners. And so when Raisi ran, the Iranians ensured that it was only hardcore candidates who were running, who had checked all the blocks in terms of meeting the desires, first of all, the supreme leader, but the other hardliners, and in particular the IRGC, who has become a major player now. And they will be the organization to watch as this plays out. In fact,
we spoke about it. We spoke about it last time, and you've written about this. And so those of our listeners and viewers who are interested in the IRGC, please go and read Gary Grappo's pieces and listen to his videos on the IRGC.
Yes, and they hold extraordinary amount of power. They have become quite wealthy as an organization, as individuals in terms of their leadership, and they have a vested interest in the continuation of the current regime, despite the growing unpopularity of the regime in Iran. And so they will certainly have a say.
So they are like the Praetorian Guard now in Rome.
Probably Praetorian Guard would be the closest, but they wield considerable political power. No one will be permitted to run, and certainly the person who wins will be able to do so without the blessing of the IRGC, and likely have strong contacts within the IRGC. And there are a couple of candidates, potential candidates, who do have those credentials, and we'll have to watch those, including the current speaker, who was the former commander of the IRGC Air Force. This is the current speaker of the Iranian parliament, Ghalibaf. So there are some folks to watch, but in terms of the expectations of the Iranian public, they are very low. And this has to weigh heavily on the supreme leader, because for them, it's not worth the candle of going to the polls. And the most likely folks who will vote, of course, are the loyalists. And there is a base of loyalists, anywhere from 20 to 30% of the population, and those holding public positions who will be obliged to go by virtue of their government employment. So, and that's about it. So it's going to be another low turnout, not very inspiring for the Iranian public, and they're left just waiting for this current geriatric generation of leaders to pass and hopefully something better to come along.
So once they go to meet Allah, then others can follow.
Exactly. And so
now, on that point, on a more serious note, the real power transfer then is not from one democratically elected leader to another. The real transfer of power will happen when Khamenei dies and someone else takes his place. Now, this being Iran and this being the Middle East, there are rumors that he's maneuvering his son to succeed him. He would very much like his son to succeed him. I would very much like to know from you, as a veteran observer and analyst of the Middle East, as to what happens there. What is going on in the sanctum sanctorum of the Iranian clergy politics? It's almost like the Vatican, I suppose. Quite opaque, but still.
Yes, although even the Vatican, I think, is a bit more transparent. But yes, I mean, the two candidates currently now being bandied about is, number one, the current acting president, Mokhbar, who he's not especially well known. He's not a figure who really grabs the attention of the Iranian public, but he does have experience. And in terms of the folks who look at qualifications, including the supreme leader, there someone who has the security credentials, that is some connection to the IRGC, and he checks that block, has some management experience, and he also checks that block. He ran one of the largest bonyads, which are these charitable foundations that in some cases are worth billions of dollars. And now he is serving as the acting president. So I think it's fair to say that he will probably toss his name into the hat. And then
was he a shooting judge? If Raisi was the hanging judge, was he the shooting judge? Did he order people to be shot?
Not to my knowledge. His experience, I think, is more in the management, finance, and telecom realm, and less in the justice ministry.
So running the charities, the bonyads, so a lot of management experience, a lot of financial experience.
Right. And so, and that may be attractive to some, especially considering the difficult economic straits in which Iran currently finds itself. I mean, they've done moderately better than previously because of the decline in Russian oil exports. So they have been able to sell their oil especially to China, and to somewhat lesser extent to India.
I mean, that's really the country economy propping up the Iranian one. The Chinese are sending in money for the oil, and that means that Iran can just about stay afloat.
Exactly. And if you look at the data, their exports have increased as a result of that. And so, but greater attention needs to be paid to this. I mean, one of the strongest criticisms of Raisi was during his period as president. The Iranian currency had declined by over 50%. So their currency has taken a huge hit, and I don't think that this is something that they'll be able to ignore as they decide who are the strongest candidates. All the candidates are going to be vetted.
We are talking about the supreme leader position now. We are not talking about the elected president.
Okay, that's a little bit different. I'm talking about lucky candidates for the presidency.
Yeah, no, let's finish it. Let's finish the candidates for the presidency, and then let's talk about who could be the next supreme leader, because that's the elephant in the room, really.
That was a very short list, even with Raisi. He was probably at the top, although there are rumors that because of his poor management of the economy, he was losing his shine. And so the next in line was the fellow that you mentioned, and that is Khamenei's son, Mujtaba Khamenei. Now, he seems to be very competent. Seems in Iranian terms. He does have very, very strong ties and associations with the IRGC, which is vitally important. But he has one major detraction, and that is his relationship to the supreme leader. Everyone is very conscious of the fact that they don't want to repeat the Pahlavi function where, it's a hereditary monarchy. And unfortunately, that's how it would exactly appear if the supreme leader is followed by his son. Even though the supreme leader looks upon his son extremely favorably. He is probably the person he trusts most, obviously because of the family ties, but also because of what he has done in terms of his political career. And so, were it not for the family relationship, he would probably stand in pretty good position right now. And he's a relatively young man, I think in his 50s. So, yeah, he would be otherwise in very good position were it not for this family relationship. And that will weigh very, very heavily.
To be president.
No, to be supreme leader.
To be supreme leader. So we are talking about the supreme leader.
Yeah, but the same argument holds for president. That the optics would be very bad if both the supreme leader and the president were father and son. Yeah, that would look a little too hereditary, little too Pahlavi.
And Iranians are still touchy about that and this is a revolutionary regime at the end of the day.
Absolutely. The problem in revolutionary regimes and particularly in autocracies like Iran is that the longer they last, the shorter or the more shallow the talent pool. The reason being that the principal criteria to rise to the top are fealty to the ideology and loyalty to the person in charge. And so people of talent, brilliance, insight, inspiration don't fit those requirements. These are not the loyal type. Those kind of folks challenge authority. That's just the way they think. They want to challenge the prevailing view, challenge the prevailing ideology and policies and so forth. And that's not how you get ahead in any autocracy, and certainly this one. And so the talent pool is very, very shallow. And as a result, they're not going to have a long list of people from which to choose.
Okay, so for the presidency, we have the current president and the speaker, the two candidates, really. The speaker who headed IRGC's Air Force, and the current president who has run charitable foundations and has management/financial experience. And for the supreme leader, we have Khomeini's son lurking in the shadows, but there is a cloud hanging over him. And is there anyone else that we should be keeping an eye on?
Yeah, there is Saeed Jalili,
a direct descendant of the Prophet.
Yes. He comes from a...
Or so he says, or so he claims.
Yes. His name is well recognized throughout Iran, strong ties to the IRGC. Folks may remember his name from the nuclear negotiations back in 2014 and 15, in which he played a very prominent role and at one point led them. So he has run previously and not done well, but he may feel that his chances are a bit better this time around. And so
this is for the presidency, a third candidate.
Correct. Yeah, he possibly could run. And then there is, of course, Ali Larijani, who at one time was considered a hardliner. Today, given how they measure those things, he might be considered as somewhat of a moderate. He aligned with Rouhani when Rouhani was president, and he is a former speaker of the Iranian parliament. And he comes from a very well-known clerical family. So he has good credentials. He is a former member of the Expediency Council. This is part of this abstruse organizational framework that the Iranians have. The Expediency Council vets legislation after it's passed by parliament to ensure it meets certain Islamic criteria. And he served...
Very expedient, as the name suggests.
Yes.
Well, the parliament has passed the law, but we've got to make sure it aligns with the Quran and the Hadith and our Shia theology. And oops, that law you passed is sin. It's not virtue. So off the books it goes.
Yeah. By the way, all of these candidates, before their name can appear on the ballot, will have to pass muster before the Guardian Council, which, as the name implies, they sort of protect the revolution. And
everyone there is only 102 years old.
Well, it could either be that or the Assembly of Experts, which is, the sort of the third leg of this.
They're only 82 there.
Yeah, as one Iranian expert whom I've followed put it, the average age is deceased.
So you have the Guardian Council, the Expediency Council, and the expert assembly of experts. So walk me through this. So let's say Gary Grappo, let's imagine, is Sayed, whatever, Sayed Rafsanjani, and he decides he wants to run for elections. So what does that what does he have to do? Does he have to first go and kiss ass in the Guardian Council? Is that how it begins? I want to stand for president.
Well, he's first you officially register as a candidate, and then your name and various credentials then are presented to the Guardian Council for review and vetting. And by the way, that holds true not only for the presidency, but for anyone running for parliament. So they're vetted there. Most of the candidates who are seen as insufficiently Islamic, insufficiently revolutionary are disqualified. And increasingly, we're finding more and more candidates who fall in the category of disqualified. And that's what happened when Raisi ran. I mean, basically, he ran against a lot of nobodies. And so, and assuming you get past that, then your name goes on the ballot, which I think the votes are cast on June 28th.
For the presidency, it's the person with the highest votes. That's it.
Yes.
It's the first past the post system. Let's say there are 20 candidates and the guy who gets 32% of the vote, does that person become president?
That's the way I understand it, yes.
Okay. And then for the parliamentarians, is it first past the post system as well, that you get a constituency? Someone gets North Iran, someone gets South, someone gets East, someone West, someone Tehran, someone Isfahan, etc., etc. You represent your constituency, and again, all you need to do is get one more vote more than than the number two,
than anyone else.
Yeah. Okay, that's fairly straightforward, actually, quite British in some sense.
Yeah, the kink in it all is having this Guardian Council vet all the candidates. And that ensures that only the right people, I'm putting air quotes around the term right, are able to run.
So it is supposedly a democracy, but it's a tightly managed democracy.
Correct. Very tightly managed.
So an autocracy masquerading as a democracy, if we are going to be accurate.
So tightly managed that the democratic structure loses any meaning.
Understood. Now, so we've gone through the presidential candidates. So now let me talk about who might succeed the supreme leader, because he's 85. Rumors are he's not in good health. Maybe he'll last till 100. Maybe he won't. I mean, there's a huge element of uncertainty. And of course, the supreme leader's position is far more important than the president's.
Correct. Well, it was very interesting because Khamenei is only the second supreme leader they've had. Khomeini was the first. And when they wrote the new constitution, they wrote in the requirement that any candidate for supreme leader had to be an Ayatollah. Khamenei was not. He was a mujtahid.
Okay, please explain the difference, because most people don't know the difference between Ayatollahs and mujtahids.
Literally speaking, an Ayatollah is someone who is a focus of emulation. That is, people follow this person because of their clerical credentials and the various writings and sermons that they have delivered.
So a bit like a bishop or archbishop, a big and respected figure.
Yes, but it takes quite a while to acquire that title. And very often...
And how do you acquire it?
That's just it. That, formally speaking, it's when, a mass of people declare you to be an Ayatollah.
And who are these mass of people? Are these clergymen?
Some clergy who sort of endorse the support of the masses, that this is a subject of emulation. This is a person whose writings and speeches provide proper guidance to Muslims. So the process is a bit opaque and not very definitive. I I met one grand Ayatollah when I was in
Oh,
Iraq.
Lord, there's a grand Ayatollah too.
Yes, there's a grand Ayatollah. There aren't many of
And
those.
what was he like? Did he have halo around his head? Did he walk in and you felt you were in the presence of a messenger from Allah?
Quite the opposite. I found him, first of all, to be an incredibly charming gentleman. He was quite old. I'd say probably in his late 70s, maybe 80s. I don't even know if he's alive today. He had a sort of a grandfatherly demeanor to him, very charming. The one thing that really shone through to me was his brilliance. I mean, this was a genuinely well-read man, particularly on theology and philosophy, and not just Shia Islam. He could talk about Christianity and Judaism, monotheism. He had studied all the monotheistic faiths quite closely, and
Not Hinduism or Buddhism and all those Eastern.
I'm sure he had studied them, but not to the extent that he had Christianity and Judaism. And in fact, he very proudly, when I was in his library, surrounded floor to ceiling with books, pointed to a small shelf right behind him that held copies of the Quran, the Torah, and the Christian Bible. And he said, I read
The Jewish Torah, the Christian Bible, quite an ecumenical chap. So
and he proudly claimed he read all three every day, which truly impressed me. So, but those individuals, the grand ayatollahs, are truly rarefied clerical figures. But in order to be a supreme leader, you had to be an ayatollah. But they broke that rule when they named Khamenei.
yeah, but what's a mujtahid?
Mujtahid is the next level down. The next level down. So you're sort of building a following.
How many levels are there? How many levels are there? Are there 20? Are there 5? Are there 10?
I think, not counting being a student or a seminarian, I believe there are 4, but I wouldn't, don't quote me on that. I had another friend who was, I think he was a mujtahid, but I can't be sure, friend / more of a business associate in Iraq who had studied at their famous seminary in Iraq. And he had kind of pursued a political career as opposed to religious, but he sort of schooled me on some of these. And then I had a colleague who was also a Shia Muslim. So I think 4 maybe breaks down, and the mujtahid is probably the second from the top, not counting the grand ayatollah. So Khamenei was a mujtahid, and they changed the constitution to allow mujtahids to be candidates for the supreme leader, which would then qualify, at least on religious grounds, Khamenei's son, who's a mujtahid.
Good. So there will be a number of hats thrown into the ring, and we could very well see the republic turn into a monarchy.
What I would say about all of this, Atul, is the following. Raisi's death will not change Iranian policies to the extent that any of us will be able to see. Domestic policy, and certainly their foreign policy and security policy, will remain virtually the same as it was under Raisi. What does change, however, is the future of Iran's leadership, because Raisi was touted to be the most likely candidate to succeed Khamenei as supreme leader. He is out of the picture now, and they will probably turn. I don't think they're going to turn to his son. They're going to have to turn to one of the better known clerics, and there are anywhere from a half dozen to maybe a dozen of those who sort of check all the blocks when it comes to the clerical qualifications, but then we'll have very spotty records when it comes to experience with the military or the IRGC and actual management experience in the Iranian government. So, I mean, they do look for that. I think they especially like to get someone who has some economic management experience because that's what they really need. It would be nice if they could get someone, I don't think they're thinking along these lines, but someone who could inspire the younger generation, because right now, young people in Iran are are terribly uninspired by their leadership.
In fact,
They don't.
many have lost faith in Islam. One hears of tales of crazy parties behind closed doors. Apparently, if you like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, Iran is the place to be.
There's just sort of rebellion that's going on right now against the regime, against the religion, against these mandatory dress codes, all of these things. The Iranian youth, I'm talking about people who are under 30, are rebelling against this, and even those in the 30 to 50 age group, maybe not quite so rebellious because they have families, jobs, and so on and so forth, but certainly not enamored in the least with this current leadership and would like to see changes, particularly because of two things: the gross mismanagement of the economy, which has imposed a considerable hardship on the Iranian people, and secondly, the constraints, the social constraints that have been imposed on them, young people in particular.
I mean, one thing we have to give the Islamic Republic its due is that they have increased literacy in the country, which was not the case under the Shah. Now, the flip side of that success is that women have higher expectations, and educated Iranian women who are incredibly sophisticated, who are now in all sorts of fields, from film direction to medicine, do not want to play the same historic role. And they are chafing against the heavy hand of clerics. So the people, one, of course, the economy is bad. There are no jobs. There are absolutely no jobs. Two, you have an educated population with higher expectations, especially women, who are chafing against the day-to-day restrictions. So it's not a good recipe for the future.
Most definitely, and that probably galls younger people more because they wonder what kind of a future they're going to have. And the third matter that's weighing on their minds is the insidious corruption that exists throughout the regime right now. That these hardliners in the IRGC and the political establishment are skimming off the top, whereas they
and our listeners should remember that that was one of the key reasons for the 1979 revolution. The Shah's regime was notoriously corrupt. The Shah was blowing up hundreds of millions of dollars in crazy parties. Especially the Persepolis one was notorious. Now, the mullahs haven't done anything quite as extravagant as that, but they've relapsed to the same corrupt practices, or some of the same corrupt practices of the Shah, and this is causing enormous heartburn, not just amongst young people, but amongst the true believers in the revolution.
Correct. So, for lots of reasons, the Iranian people, particularly in the younger ones, but I'd say even in the middle age category, would really, really love to see some change. But they know the chances of that are very, very slim because those in power, in the short run,
things last until they don't. The Soviet Union one day collapsed, it imploded. So there are no guarantees in life and no guarantees when it comes to states.
And that's the fear. That is the fear, is that they will run out of the talent that's necessary to perpetuate the regime. When that will happen, no one can predict, but I think we're beginning to see some signs of that now, because they are going to have to look at individuals they previously had not considered and have not really been tested in genuine leadership positions. My concern is that even if they can't decide on a clear choice for the supreme leader, the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is going to ensure that the regime continues under any guise, whether it's a theocracy or a military dictatorship, and that for any reason, the clerics cannot take the baton from one generation to the next. They will be there to do it because of the enormous vested interest that they have in the perpetuation of the regime. They're doing quite well, the IRGC, and I mean that on a personal basis as well as a political power basis. They probably wield more power than any other institution, with the exception of the supreme leader.
So they are now a state within the state. And to end this discussion, as you said, the thinning of talent is the biggest challenge that this regime will face, and perhaps even IRGC, if the IRGC replaces the clerics. And in some ways, an incompetent pilot flying through the fog is a metaphor for Iran today.
Excellent. I actually like that. Iran right now is flying in a bit of a fog, and unlike that helicopter, in this case, they have enemies outside. They have enemies, and they know it. Iran is a very isolated country, very isolated. Yes, they've been able to sidle up to the Chinese and the Russians and probably the North Koreans, as one U.S. administration person put it, the axis of jerks, who are basically, and then another publication called it the axis of upheaval, and that's pretty much what it is, trying to break the current global order to the extent that it exists. But the Iranians have very, very few allies, and those they have are brought together by one single factor, and that is to somehow unseat or weaken the United States and its global power. You take away that, and they have very little in common. Of course, the Iranians have a certain dependency because of their economic situation, and therefore they do have to be very, very cautious in their dealings with China. They desperately need China as an outlet for their oil. Currently, they've now been able to establish a very profitable relationship with Russia by selling them drones and missiles for Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. So they've been able to leverage some very adverse circumstances surprisingly well. They have used the axis of resistance. This is various militia groups throughout the Middle East, whether in Syria, Iraq, of course, Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen, to wreak considerable havoc throughout the Middle East and cause the United States and Israel considerable headache. So in terms of the regime, they probably look at themselves as, given the circumstances, not doing so badly. But from the perspective of the Iranian people, things are quite bad, and there's not much hope for their future at the moment.
All right. On that note, thank you so much for listening to us. Do follow us on Spotify, Apple. Listen to us on our website. We'll see you anon.